From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Westin. We're going to start with the markets once again today. Abigail Doolittle is here. It's been a little bit of an odd day, actually, Abigail. I thought it was going to be risk off. Now it seems to be a little risk on. What's going on?
It is a bit of a strange day here because we do have stocks solidly higher at this point. The major averages each up about 1% or more. The NASDAQ is lagging a little bit on the day. But to your point around the idea that it felt as though it was going to be risk off, of course, we had that sell-off last week. We had a down week last week. Out of the last 4 weeks, 2 of them have been down. This, of course, is the virus data here in the U.S. has been worsening. And so there had felt last week like there was a connection to that. Today, not so much. David, some of this may have to do with the fact that we're coming up to the end of the quarter. Right now, for the S&P 500, we're looking at the best quarter since 1998. The NASDAQ, the best quarter since 2001. So you may just be in this situation now where managers want to lock this one in. Of course, this comes after the worst quarter in quite some time on that March quarter. So again, cruise control into the end of quarter, reassess once July begins, David.
Abigail, as you say, the virus is always lurking out there, and last week it sort of took its toll on the markets. At the same time, I did notice that apparently corporations are starting to up their estimates about earnings coming up. We might get back to fundamentals here at some point.
Well, hopefully that happens indeed, because at the end of the day, that is what it all comes down to, the U.S. corporate profit outlook. But with this virus lurking, and especially the idea that we may still be in this first wave that, of course, hit here in New York first, and now it's spreading around the country, that has to make it very difficult for companies to really plan for the future. So to the degree that they're able to bring up estimates a little bit for the future, they, of course, were brought down a lot. So still lots of uncertainty there. It's really one of those cases where the proof is going to be in the pudding. Let's see how many stores. Of course, we had Apple closing some of their stores. Let's see how this reopening process goes. Let's see how the payrolls report, which is coming out on Thursday, goes for the month of June. So much data, David, so much uncertainty. It's going to be quite some time before I think we truly have a clear picture, but hopefully we do have a reconnection to what you were talking about, a move back toward the fundamentals and not just traders moving against and on the backdrop, I should say, of all of the Fed liquidity.
Yeah, we do have those jobs numbers coming out, and there's such a wide range in estimates. Nobody quite knows what we're going to see on Thursday. But thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Well, it's just about a little over 4 months now to go until the election. And at this point, it looks like President Trump may have an uphill battle to reclaim the presidency for a second term. We're going to bring in now Greg Valliere. He is AGF Investments Chief U.S. Policy strategist. So, Greg, welcome. It's always great to talk with you. Give us a sense from inside the Beltway. How tough a time does President Trump have in front of him over this next 4 months?
Well, it's still June, David. I mean, a lot is going to happen between now and then. And I think he's going to define Joe Biden in his own terms. So a lot can happen between now and then. But you got to say, if the election were held tomorrow, Trump would lose decisively, and he'd probably take the Senate down with him.
How much of this is President Trump and how much of this is biology, frankly? It's the disease and the economic response to it. How much of this is just outside of his power?
Yeah, that's a fair point. The virus is no one's fault, but his ratings, his polls on handling the virus are pretty soft. And then you've got the racial issues and the protests, and his ratings on those are really weak. I'm not sure that Trump leads by 14 points, as some recent polls have indicated, but Biden's ahead by a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, he has a new problem, apparently, on his platter, that is President Trump, with these reports that perhaps there were intelligence reports that, in fact, Russia was offering bounties. President Trump has denied that adamantly, but we've had further news reports that say, no, he was briefed on that. How big a deal is that? Is that a tempest in a teapot, or could that really get legs?
Well, it doesn't help Trump. I think both parties want to get to the bottom of this. If there's even some truth to it, it's pretty outrageous. A lot of Republicans who made a big deal over Benghazi are going to have to look at this as even more serious.
At the same time, we've always thought, and President Trump himself, I think, has thought that really ultimately the strength of his presidency turns on the economy. He came in saying, I'm going to grow the economy. That's what I commit. I'm going to grow jobs. Obviously, the pandemic's really set him back. But in that light, how important is the next round of fiscal stimulus? Where is that? And why has the president sort of put the brakes on it, at least slowed it down?
Well, you make a really good point. There seems to be no real momentum right now for a stimulus bill. They're on holiday now for another week and a half. They come back for 3 weeks, and then they go for the rest of the summer in the first week of August. So is there enough momentum for a stimulus bill? I think we'll get one. The unemployment report on Thursday will be important. I think there's a feeling the states and local governments have to get some more assistance. I think you've got Jerome Powell, Mnuchin, and, of course, the president all wanting another stimulus bill. So I think there'll be one, but it sure isn't going to be a $3 trillion bill like Nancy Pelosi wants. Maybe it's more like $1.5 trillion.
At the same time, there's something of a cliff coming up here with the unemployment, the supplemental unemployment insurance that expires at the end of July. We also have the specter of layoffs at state and local governments as well, as they really come up against their own budgetary constraints. So there is a deadline, isn't there, for them to get something done?
Yeah, that deadline, as you say, is the 31st of July, and you hear more and more anecdotes from cities and states who have run out of money, have to lay off more workers. So going back to your premise that the president needs to see a stronger economy, I think it's crucial for him to get a stimulus bill. As much as Jerome Powell has done, and I think he's been fabulous, I think you need more from Congress.
Greg, you said something terribly important, which is basically if the election were today, it looks like President Trump could lose decisively. But also there's the question of the Senate. I mean, if you go back 6-9 months, most people didn't think there was much chance the Democrats could take the Senate. What is the realistic possibility of that?
That's a really big deal. We've been telling our clients, David, that is a race you've got to watch because right now it's 53 to 47 Republican. The Republicans have at least 3 or 4 seats that look shaky. The Democrats have, in my opinion, only 1 seat that looks shaky. So if we got the trifecta, the Democrats controlling the White House, the Senate, and the House, in my opinion, that would not be a good scenario for the markets. The markets like divided government, and if the Democrats actually take the Senate, all of this activist legislation that will emerge from the House could have a much better path than if the Republicans kept the Senate.
So, Greg, as you say, activist legislation, but quite specifically, how much of the markets really focused, do you think, on taxes? Because the Democrats seem pretty determined to reverse those tax cuts, maybe impose some new taxes.
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. I mean, if I were advising Joe Biden, I'm not. I would say maybe you'd want to wait if you win to make sure the economy is back on its feet. But I think at some point in 2021 or 2022, there would be a significant tax increase on corporations and wealthy individuals. There'll be other activist legislation, Green New Deal, Medicare for All, things like that. But you're absolutely right. The tax story is the big one, and that's why the Senate outcome is so crucial.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's going to be a fascinating 4 months. As you say, it's a long time, actually, in the world of politics. Thanks so much to Greg Valliere of AGF Investments. Coming up here, we're on the brink of having the USMCA go into effect, so we're going to talk to the Canadian ambassador to the United States about what that well might mean. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. In Florida, the coronavirus pandemic is picking up steam. The rate of people testing positive for the first time climbed to 13.7% for Sunday. Miami Beach Mayor Dan Gelber tells Bloomberg that Florida needs more than it's getting from the federal government.
The messaging from Washington has not been help everybody else, help yourself. It's been don't wear a mask or stand up against this or stand up against that. It's so unhelpful. We need direction and we need leadership.
Florida has had more than 46,000 new cases over the past 7 days, the highest since the coronavirus pandemic began. A divided U.S. Supreme Court has struck down a Louisiana law that required abortion clinic doctors to get admitting privileges at a local hospital. The justices defied expectations by reinforcing reproductive rights. Chief Justice John Roberts provided the crucial vote, joining the court's liberal wing in the 5-4 majority. He said he was bound by a 2016 Supreme Court ruling that struck down a similar Texas law. Iran has issued a warrant to arrest President Trump and 35 others for the killing of a top Iranian general in January. That's according to Iranian media. Qasem Soleimani was targeted in a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad. The incident was a dangerous escalation in the standoff between the two countries. The U.S. called the arrest warrant a political stunt. The Federal Reserve has revealed the names of the corporate bonds it's buying as part of its emergency lending program. In the last couple weeks, the Fed has bought debt from AT&T, United Health, and Walmart, among others. The central bank has said the goal is to maintain liquidity in the corporate debt market. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, after a long wait, the USMCA, that successor agreement to NAFTA, is due to come into effect this week. We welcome now the Canadian ambassador to the United States. She is Kirsten Hillman. So, Madam Ambassador, welcome. Good to have you here. You've been involved in all the negotiations on this. Give us a sense, come the effective date of this agreement, what will be different?
Hi, David. Thanks for having me. Well, I think what will be different is that we will have a modernized agreement that underpins the most important trading relationship for all three countries. You have to remember that the NAFTA was negotiated more than a generation ago, at a time when, for example, we didn't even have internet. So a lot has changed since the NAFTA was negotiated, in the way our businesses operate and the way our three countries work together with their supply chains. And it was time to modernize it, which is what we've done.
So was President Trump right that, in fact, NAFTA needed to be replaced, or is this more a matter of avoiding a breakdown in economic relations between the United States and Canada?
I think that the agreement needed to be modernized, for sure. It was a very important fundamental agreement to all three countries, but it was out of date. So, for example, we have now negotiated 9 new chapters dealing with things like digital commerce, competitiveness of our North American platform, trying to make sure that we are responsive to the way in which trade operates around the world and the way our competitive trading blocs, Europe and Asia and others, are operating. So make sure that we have the advantages that we need in the North American space to compete and win on the global trading stage. So that was, I think, very necessary. And we've also done some really important work on labor and environment provisions and made them completely strong and binding, some of the strongest commitments out there in the world, which is also really important to incentivize countries and companies to make sure that workers are receiving fair wages for the work that they do, and that we are protecting our environment as we are advancing our economic prosperity.
Madam Ambassador, trade harmony is something I think we all want to pursue. At the same time, even before this agreement goes into effect, we have now talk coming out of the United States about possible new tariffs going into effect once again on steel and aluminum from Canada. Where does that stand right now?
Yeah, we're having good discussions with the U.S. on this and with the USTR on this. I think, our perspective is that there is no doubt that our manufacturing sectors and our aluminum sector, among others, are feeling the challenges of the economic downturn that's being caused by COVID. Everybody's feeling that, and we're all adjusting to that. And so now's actually the time that we should be working together, and we should be mutually reinforcing. It's not the time to start putting into place expensive additional tariffs that are just going to jack up the prices for our manufacturers.
Madam Ambassador, if you would, give us some peek into that discussion that's going on back and forth between Canada and the United States. Very specifically, your Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, today said that reinstating aluminum tariffs would only hurt the United States. What's the argument to the United States that says, no, you don't want to do this for your own sake? You don't want to impose aluminum tariffs?
Right. So Canada is the #1 aluminum supplier to the U.S. The U.S. has its own domestic manufacturing of aluminum, and sells obviously into your market, but you can't meet all of your own needs. The U.S. doesn't have enough production for that. And so Canada, as a neighbor, as a country that is able to supply reliable, dependable, affordable aluminum, has always been an important partner in the manufacturing sector for the United States. In fact, some of our aluminum smelters were created in the Second World War in order to supply the U.S. military with the aluminum that it needed for your military manufacturing. And so we are recognized and have always been as not only a vital partner on the commercial stage, but as a vital partner in the North American and in the U.S. defense platform. So our perspective on this is that we are always going to be a very important, reliable, dependable partner that is integrated with the U.S. manufacturing sector and defense sector. And we should be focusing on that and not putting on tariffs that will just jack up the prices for the users of that product, who will continue to need our aluminum as we all work very hard to come out of the economic downturn that we're facing now.
Ambassador Hillman, another point of contention over the years between the United States and Canada in trade has been dairy. And we have the minority leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer from New York, now writing a letter saying, really, this is not working between the United States and Canada. What does the USMCA do, if anything, to relieve some of that pressure? Because I know this is really politically important to Canada.
Sure. It is. It's very politically important to Canada. Our dairy sector is a sector that we have always been very committed to ensuring that our producers are able to produce their product in a way that is sustainable for the sector and for the industry and for the culture of our dairy farmers. In the USMCA, we have granted additional access to the U.S. Producers to the Canadian dairy market, and that additional access will come into force on Wednesday when the agreement comes into force. So we are on the verge of additional access for many dairy producers coming from the United States, and I think that should be a welcome news for everyone, including the senator.
Madam Ambassador, take a step back for a moment and talk more broadly about relations between the United States and Canada in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. What has happened, basically, on people going back and forth across the border, trading in goods and services and things like that across the border? Where do you stand right now in dealing with the United States, where we do have a pandemic problem? No question about it.
Yeah. Well, look, the really good news is that back in March, Canada and the United States were able to come together very cooperatively and decide that we wanted to restrict traffic back and forth across our borders, because we were both working to manage the pandemic within our own countries. And in order to get a handle on that and see what was happening and make sure that our systems were able to support our citizens while we sought to reduce the curve, we decided cooperatively and very efficiently to continue to allow commercial travel, continue to allow transport and trade, and keep our supply chains operating. But we asked our citizens, each of us respectively, to not be traveling for non-essential and recreational purposes at this time. And the really good news is that these measures are working. They're really working. So we have, as our economies are starting to come back online, we have supply chains that are ramping up, including, in sectors where those supply chains depend very heavily on the ability of Canadians and Americans to cross back and forth across the border to feed those supply chains. So we've seen quite a significant reduction in non-essential travel, but we've seen a very small reduction in commercial travel, mostly attributed to, in fact, the economic slowdown. And as the as our economic recovery continues, what we're seeing is that the commercial travel is coming right back up to historical levels. So to my mind, it's a huge success story of our cooperation between our two countries. Maybe just one other thing to mention on the border. So the actual management of the border has happened incredibly cooperatively, but we also have Canadians and Americans who are essential workers traveling back and forth, non-commercial workers. So, for example, we have thousands of Canadians who work in the healthcare field as nurses and doctors who travel to the U.S. every day to care for American patients and then come back to Canada at night. And these are people who live in border communities who have had those professions for a very long time. And we've been able to sustain that through the pandemic because it's important and because taking care of each other at this time is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. And we are so closely related between the United States and Canada. Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador. Good to have you here. That is the Canadian Ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman. Coming up here, Stock of the Hour is going to be Facebook, who has its own set of problems with advertisers pulling out. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. Facebook is our stock of the hour. It is coming back from some worse losses today. This is on the heel of an 8% loss back Friday. And that is, of course, because several major advertisers now are pulling out of Facebook. Here to report on it is Kaylee Lyons. Kaylee, they're having some struggles there.
They are. Interestingly, the shares are now positive on the day, though that's probably just in tandem with the gains we're seeing in the broader market because the list of advertisers pulling out of Facebook is getting longer and longer. It started with Unilever on Friday. It now includes the likes of Coca-Cola, Starbucks, Hershey's, even PepsiCo. These are all companies that spend some $20 billion annually on advertising that are no longer doing so on Facebook and other social media platforms as part of an effort to get the company to further crack down on hate speech and posts with disinformation. Now, Mark Zuckerberg, in response to this on Friday, made some moves on labeling voting-related posts, expanding his prohibition on hate speech and advertising, but apparently it's doing nothing to stem the tide. Now, you have to keep in mind, David, that this is already going to be a difficult year for Facebook from the top-line standpoint, given that advertisers are pulling back because of the pandemic. Analysts only expect sales growth of about 1% this quarter, which would be the slowest since the company went public by far. And these pullbacks add some risk to that view. Diageo, for example, one of the top advertisers, spent more than $100 million on the Facebook platform last year, and it is not going to do so for the time being, David.
Yeah, Kaylee, as you suggest, it's a little hard to figure out how much is just advertisers pulling back, period. And by the way, maybe making a point of this to really make a point on civil rights in doing it, and how much it really is specific to something Facebook's doing.
Right, that's a very good point. I will say that this does seem to be a more targeted boycott, and there is some concern on the part of civil rights groups, for example, that are not concerned, but they suspect that other companies will be kind of peer pressured into doing this as there are these growing calls for social justice issues. It's just a question of how much of an impact it's really going to have, because even if half of the top 100 advertisers on Facebook pull out, that's only an impact of about $500 million. They're expected to make more than $18 billion this quarter, David.
Thank you so much to Kaylee Lyons. In the meantime, coming up here, we're going to talk with Dr. Marc Boom of Houston Methodist after that report about pressures on Houston hospitals on Friday. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has a lot of questions for intelligence officials about a report that Russia paid bounties for Americans and allied troops to be killed in Afghanistan. Speaker Pelosi calls the report disturbing and wants to know whether President Trump was given the information. And she also wants to know why Congress wasn't told of the intelligence. The president says U.S. intelligence agencies didn't believe the information was credible, and so they didn't brief him on it. The U.S. Supreme Court turned away a legal attack on President Trump's border wall today. Justices rejected an appeal that questioned a law that let the administration waive more than 40 federal statutes to start construction. The appeal was made by 4 environmental and wildlife protection organizations who said that was a violation of the Constitution. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is acknowledging that the coronavirus pandemic has been a, quote, disaster for Britain. The Prime Minister also announced a spending splurge designed to get the country back on track. Johnson has lined up big money pledges on schools, housing, and infrastructure in an attempt to move on from an outbreak that has left more than 43,000 Britons dead, the worst confirmed death toll in Europe. In Greece, the government is easing more lockdown measures. The government says movie theaters, casinos, and summer camps can reopen. It's also allowing concerts, conferences, and fairs to be held. Greece imposed a lockdown early on in the country's coronavirus outbreak, a move that has been credited with keeping the number of deaths and critically ill patients low. Greece has had about 3,300 cases and fewer than 200 deaths. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, Harris County, Texas, that's the home of Houston, announced on Friday that it was going to go to the highest level of alert as COVID-19 cases continued to rise and ICU beds came into short supply. Welcome now Dr. Marc Boom. He's president and CEO of Houston Methodist. It's a hospital system with more than 2,300 beds and 24,000 employees. So, Dr. Boom, thank you so much for being with us. Give us an update on where things are, because we heard reports on Friday maybe you were out of ICU beds, you were full up, but now I hear maybe that's not right.
Yeah, that's right. Let me start by saying in Houston, the virus is really spreading very rapidly, and we're highly concerned with that. So I want everything I say coming next to be clear with that unless we do something as the citizens of Houston, our leadership and others to stem this spread, we are very concerned about the trends we are seeing. ICU beds are really one of the core things that we measure when we look at how are we able to respond to this. And last week, there were reports that we were out of ICU beds, but they really came a little more from some, I think, misunderstanding of complex data that hospital executives, physicians, and others struggle with ourselves sometimes. Normally, we run about 90-95% occupancy, and we've been running about 90-95% occupancy in our ICUs. But the difference now is, of course, about 1 in 4 of those patients have COVID versus, a year ago where none of them would have had COVID. So we've already been making many adjustments to handle that. We have a lot of ability to upregulate and have additional ICU beds, but of course that's not an unlimited supply. And so we are working very hard with that, working very hard to manage that. But unless we bend this curve and unless we have people across Houston, really every single one of them locking arms and saying, I got you and we got you covered, and wearing their mask and social distancing and all the other things they need to do, frankly, staying home at this point, unless you need to be out of the home, we're worried that we're seeing very rapid acceleration of the spread right now based on the testing data that we see.
Give us a sense of the demographics, as it were, of the sorts of patients you're seeing coming in, and particularly in ICU having COVID-19. Is it similar to what we saw in New York? That is to say, it tends to be the elderly and people with underlying conditions, or is it changing? On Friday, once again, Vice President Pence suggested it's younger people now.
Yeah, that's correct. It is changing, and that's that certainly is a cushion a little bit to some of the dynamics, but it's not going to solve them. So in that first wave, we would see about 60% of people getting admitted or getting tested positive, rather, were over 50. Now we're seeing that completely flip, so it's 60% under 50. Back in that first wave, maybe 1 in 5 of our patients who were in ICU were younger than 50. Now that's rapidly approaching 1 in 3. So we're seeing a lot of very young people who do need ICU care. There's this misperception that, young people don't get sick. The average young person doesn't get sick, but if you have enough young people who are getting the virus, some of them get extraordinarily sick. We've had patients on ECMO. We've had a young mother who was on ECMO for over 2 weeks to save her life. We did, thankfully, able to go home to her baby after more than a month after she delivered. These are tough situations. And so we have to have everybody. And right now, frankly, with the data we're seeing, especially the younger population, recognizing that there is no way to get this under control unless everybody does their part.
Is the treatment also evolving? We don't have a vaccine yet. We don't know when we'll get one. There's a lot of talk about treatments. For example, remdesivir, we heard from Gilead today, it's going to be pretty expensive to administer this stuff. How are you treating these people who really have severe cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also, I think a cause for some cautious optimism, at least once somebody gets hospitalized, is that the outcomes have really improved a great deal. So mortality has gone down significantly, and it doesn't completely compute just with the age shift. That's a major factor. But we have learned so much. We've been caring for patients with COVID for over 100 days now. Our clinicians are smart. They've learned a lot. We were the first hospital in the country to use convalescent convalescent serum. And we've been very active in the remdesivir trials. And in both cases, we think those have been quite helpful. But there's a lot of other things that are more nuts and bolts, honestly. Proning, which means putting somebody on their stomach. It was a technique that had been used in the past for really sick people on a ventilator in an ICU. Now it's recognized really for patients who are in an acute care bed, so they're not so sick to be in ICU. And it's actually preventing people from deteriorating. So what we're seeing is, even though our volumes compared to the last peak are well more than double, our ICU utilization is up from that time, but not nearly as much. And I think we're keeping people out of ICU. The length of stay we're seeing is about a day and a half shorter for people who do stay here. So those are some good news. But the challenge is that in the community, this virus is spreading rapidly. And unless our community works together to get that spread under control, we are very concerned that many thousands of people could get infected, people will die, and the economy really will take a real beating again, as either through, incremental government orders, or frankly, just simply because the virus is, effectively disrupting organizations and companies and businesses' ability to function, that we will see significant negative economic impact in addition.
Dr. Boom, if you had your druthers, what would you want out of the government? And I'm talking about the state government with Governor Abbott, who was relatively eager to get things open back up, had to dial back on taverns, I think you call them. What would you like to see out of the governor? What would you like to see out of the mayor, out of the Harris County government to try to really curtail this?
So we were really grateful on Friday. The governor shut down all bars across the state. I think that's been a really troublesome area. I mean, clearly we've seen young people, but I don't want to blame this all on young people. That's not really my point, but that's not a safe setting. I think there are some additional settings we really need to question right now. One of the things I'm very concerned about is the size of gatherings that are still allowed. I'm really concerned about the 4th of July. So when we look back at the data, really the thing that to me accelerated things so much in our community was Memorial Day. We saw people just sort of throwing caution to the wind, saying, hey, summer's here, we're going to relax, we're going to do whatever we want. We saw them cramming into swimming pools, cramming across a beach, having all sorts of barbecues. Nobody was protecting themselves. And that kind of, looseness has kind of continued. I think it's starting to shift back, thankfully, now, but it's not moved back enough. And I'm really worried that we're a few days away from the 4th of July. And, if Memorial Day was throwing a bunch of wood on the fire and in the early kindling, and that we've kind of been stoking for a while, we have the risk that a 4th of July could be like, pouring a can of gasoline. And so we really need to figure out how, we message that, our patriotic duty to each other is to keep each other safe, and we need to stay home. I mean, we need to celebrate the 4th of July with the people we live with in our household. Have a backyard barbecue with your own family or your household members and not with others, and watch fireworks from a car. Don't get out of your car. Stay home, watch, something on TV, but don't celebrate with large gatherings. We really need to keep people away from interacting with each other in that way, because I'm very concerned that'll accelerate the spread even more.
And we certainly need the community to participate, to comply with that. But why doesn't the government just order everybody to stay home? I mean, here I am in New York. They ordered us, Governor Cuomo ordered us to do it. It wasn't very popular, but he said for a period of time, you just got to stay home and stay with your family. Why don't they do that in Houston? Why don't they do that in Texas?
Well, it's kind of above my pay grade, one of those things. I mean, we obviously have been in a regular conversation with all government leaders about what the situation on the ground, where we are. I mean, the good news is the hospitals are managing this so far. The bad news is the virus is spreading very rapidly in our community. And of course, we cannot indefinitely continue to ramp up hospital beds. I think we have some runway on that, but we've got to get everyone doing the right thing across our community. And we need very consistent messaging from all levels of government, all of the press. One of the unfortunate things we've ended up with is that, masks have become such a political issue. The reality is masks were one of the best techniques to allow us to open up the economy. And unfortunately, this dialogue started that said they weren't the right thing. They are most emphatically the right thing to do right now. And we need everybody wearing a mask when they do go out. But frankly, we're getting to a point where if you're not going for a valid, good reason to an important business around town, particularly if you're vulnerable, you need to stay home, and you need to stay home with your family. We have to stop all the connections that are happening in the community to get some better control of this. And then, we'll be in good shape, and we can do all the things we're trying to do, which is protect first and foremost each other, but also protect our economy. And this doesn't have to be a dichotomy. There can be an and if we all do our part. But the and of having an economy that can still function and, of course, protecting people only works if you have across Houston the 7 million people, each and every one of them, doing this for each other.
Thank you so much. It sounds like very sound advice. That's Dr. Marc Boom. He is the president and CEO of Houston Medical. Coming up here on Balance of Power, we're going to talk with a former senior State Department official responsible for international energy affairs, Amos Hochstein. He's going to talk about the difficult transition away from fossil fuels. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, the collapse in oil prices put a lot of pressure on the markets, but it also did some extraordinary things in some developing countries that really are not very easy to deal with. To talk about those, we will welcome now Amos Hochstein. He was the special envoy for international energy affairs under the Obama administration. He is now an executive vice president with the natural gas company of Tellurian. So, Amos, thank you for being with us. You have a terrific piece out in the Atlantic actually explaining this to say, pay attention to some of these countries because they really depend critically on the price of oil. When you've got it down, it's back up about $38 or so, but still, it's not at the level they need.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. What I discussed in the piece is really the challenges that we're facing, that COVID has really given us a preview to what we're going to face with the energy transition world. So as the energy transitions away from oil and oil demand wanes, and whether or not we've reached peak oil already or we're going to reach it sometime in the future, we're going to have to pay attention to some countries that have a higher volatility rate today already. And with a challenge where oil prices collapse to even where they are now in the high 30s, they cannot make their budgets. And over time, that's going to create more instability and more risk that we will all face as a global community, whether it's in Iraq with ISIS coming back and increasing their levels of attack if you can't pay the military and can't create an economy, whether it's in Nigeria where Boko Haram and you have that fragile apparatus of security between the different communities. But even in our own neighborhood, Mexico and Ecuador have what people don't realize is a high dependency on revenues for the government from oil.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you propose, basically, what you say, let's do away with these silos where you have the climate change people over here, the energy policy people here, you have the national security people here. It's all of a piece. We all have to work together because sooner or later we're going to move away from fossil fuels, and there's got to be some alternative for some of these countries.
That's exactly right. I think that not only in the United States, but globally, we are very siloed. We have our national security experts, our foreign policy diplomats, we have our climate experts, and we have our business leaders and economic leaders, and they don't sit around the same table. So when we start talking about, I sometimes try to imagine what's the next Paris Accord negotiations look like. We have to have the business community, the finance community, the international financial institutions, together with the national security experts joining the climate folks, and to look at, okay, what happens if we're going to have an energy transition over the next several years to these countries so that we don't have a side effect of a rise in terrorism, a rise in massive amounts of migration, because if sub-Saharan Africa and some areas in Central and South America are suddenly of critical revenues, and we're talking about sometimes 90% of revenues, and even in Mexico, it's about a third of government tax revenues. If you just magically just take that away overnight, or even over a short period of time, that's going to have an impact. If we want to solve some of the migration issues in the U.S., we're going to have to stop thinking about it as building walls and things like that, and actually make sure that there is economic activity on the other side that incentivizes people to stay where they are, to have economic activity, and to have mature and happy lives. And we have to make sure that's true across the globe. So and it's going to take massive amounts of investment. And that's why I think the IMF, together with nonprofits and the banks, need to come together and say, what are the countries that are most at risk? And how do we incentivize economic activity in those countries to prevent the kind of risks and challenges that I foresee?
Yeah, and Amos, it's critically important to identify the problem first and maybe set some goals. At the same time, achieving is something different. This is not the first time in history that an oil-rich country has said we need to diversify and have other industries. Has it ever worked? I mean, Russia's been working on this for years. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is trying it once again. You've had this in Nigeria. You've had it in Venezuela, country after country. Has any country ever managed to do that?
Yeah, you bring up a very good point that this is not a new issue. But I think that it's a different circumstance that we're facing now. I think that before it only happened during oil shocks, price shocks, when the late 90s, when we had the price go down to $10 a barrel. What happens now is different. What the corona crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, has given us is a window or a dress rehearsal for what's going to be coming down the pike. And then it won't be temporary. It won't be part of a cycle. It's going to be something more systemic and ongoing into the future, and it will become the new normal of low oil prices at that point as demand wanes. And demand won't go away. It will just stop growing first. It will peak, and then it will start declining slowly. And that's why I think we have to think about it a little bit differently. The countries you mentioned have resources, they have reserves, and they're in a different category of needing to spend those resources in order to diversify their economy. I'm worried that in the first wave, we have to think about countries that do not have any reserves, that live on a budget knife's edge, where any collapse in price, even a small one or a short-term one, has major implications. And the lower for longer scenario has catastrophic implications. And that's where I think we have to focus first. So you're right. The world has not done it. We've never done it. We've talked ad nauseum about it. What needs to change is to recognize what did we do wrong. And what we did wrong is we saw it as development assistance. We were giving charity. That's not what this needs to be. It needs to be investment driven and economic buildup with the community, the global community coming together to achieve it.
Yeah. And your piece in the Atlantic is an important first step in that direction. Thank you so much to Amos Hochstein. He is now with Tellurian. In the meantime, coming up here, we're going to talk about two important Supreme Court decisions today, one on abortion, one on the CFPB. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The Supreme Court of the United States today issued a really important decision on abortion. And here to take us through is Greg Storr. He's our Supreme Court reporter. So, Greg, a lot of people were looking at this for some indication of where Roe against Wade was going. I'm not sure we got that.
And the opinion from John Roberts that was the key to the case said we're starting with the premise that the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision, which is the 92 ruling that reaffirmed Roe, he said that we're starting with that as our premise. Nobody's asking us to overturn that ruling. But it did suggest that the Chief Justice is going to stick pretty closely to precedent here unless there's a compelling reason to do otherwise.
You know, it was a fascinating case for a couple of reasons. I thought, first of all, there's no majority opinion. It's 4 people for one opinion. Then Chief Justice Roberts by himself joining the judgment, not the opinion. And at the same time, Chief Justice Roberts voted the other way on the case that he's deferring to when it came up a few years ago.
Yeah, and he spent much of the opinion explaining why he still thought he was right in that case. But he said because the Louisiana law in this case requiring all doctors who perform abortions to have admitting privileges at a local hospital was virtually identical to the Texas law the court struck down 4 years ago. He said the analysis here is the same. It has a significant burden on the ability of women to get an abortion if they want one, and therefore I'm going to abide by the precedent and vote to strike it down.
Yeah, I'm not sure this was ever on the table, but some people were concerned about maybe with the new justice on the Supreme Court, they might overturn Roe against Wade. If there's concern about that, I would take what Chief Justice Roberts did here as being an indication, at least, not for sure, that that's not in the cards.
I would agree with that. The people who would like to see Roe overturned were really optimistic when they got first Neil Gorsuch and then Brett Kavanaugh on the court that there might be real movement in that direction. But John Roberts, at a minimum, really hit the brake pedal here. There will probably be other cases. I would be surprised if there weren't other cases where he votes to uphold abortion restrictions that might not have been allowable a few years ago. But in terms of overruling the court's precedents and calling into question the court's legitimacy in his mind, he seems very loath to do that in this context.
Finally, Greg, we're down to the bottom of the barrel here, almost to the end of the term. What's the one decision you're really looking forward to hearing?
Well, certainly there's actually two. There are the subpoena cases involving the president and his financial records. There is a case involving Congress trying to get them. There's a case involving a New York grand jury trying to get them. The president says, I have a significant privacy interest here. That's going to be a huge case no matter how it comes out.
Right. Greg, it's always great to talk with you. That's Greg Stohr. He is the Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter. In the meantime, we're going to have a second hour of Balance of Power on radio. We're going to talk to, among other people, Ben Wickler. He's the chairman of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. That does it for the first hour of Balance of Power. I'm David Westin. This is Bloomberg.